company, so it was really refreshing to get to hear pretty in-depth conversation there. So thank you for that. Coming up now, it seems like every single year we throw this conference. There's another pretty major data breach or hack of some sort. Last year, I believe we called it Yahoops, and this year, although it might not be the most recent hack, this one's going to be kind of focusing on life after Equifax, what we've learned from it. There's so many companies are now learning about the cost of losing data, the trust issues that come along with once you lose your data and trying to get it back. Equifax had a pretty significant stock dip after that information happened. A lot of people saw that as an opportunity to buy the dip, and some people actually profited pretty well off of seeing an overreaction. But let's see what companies now are learning from the latest Equifax hack and where this is going to be changing things going forward. So thank you to our panel.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the organizers of the Cyber Investing Summit for having us here today. As we did with the last panel, we're going to try to leave time for audience questions at the end, so please be thinking of questions as we speak. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce the panel up here. Sitting immediately to my left is Tom Kellermann, Chief Cybersecurity Officer of Carbon Black. Next to him is Sean Colicchio, Vice President of Information Security at Essextec. And finally, Shira Rubinoff, President, SecureMySocial and Prime Tech Partners. So I'll start off with a quick question, and I'll let any of you who would choose to answer it please do so. Why do you think it's so difficult in the case of a breach like Equifax to limit an attacker's success? And how much of that has to do with perhaps defenders and attackers thinking in fundamentally different ways? Anyone care to take that? Shira?
Sure. Well, I think you have to think about the attackers. There's many of them, and they're coming in from many different points of entry. I talk a lot about the weakest link in the chain, the human factor. And when you prey upon the human weakness, there's many points of entree for an attacker to gain entrance in, whether it's tricking an employee in all sorts of factors, whether it being by email, a phishing attempt. They call them all sorts of actors, the way they present themselves to gain entree. And when it's a company, they're trying to, hold the ship tight from certain sectors, but not ready for all different points of entree in all sectors. So it's a bit of a balance over there in trying to keep up with the latest attacks.
Yeah, that's good. So, John, I think there's also the perspective of whether or not an attacker is looking at the network in the same way as a defender. So, in a blue team scenario or a defense scenario, I'm looking at a vulnerability management list or a database or what have you, and trying to figure out where are the critical issues and prioritize those issues. But it lacks context usually. So as an attacker, what I'm trying to find is a kill chain or attack pattern, and I'm trying to develop or create a network diagram of critical assets and how those critical assets interact with other systems and processes, et cetera. So until the defense teams start to think as a graph of the landscape of the threat exposure that the company may have, I think that the attackers will have that edge.
Well, basically, if you look at the credit bureaus, they're the holy grail of targets for the organized hacker crews of Eastern Europe and South America, for many reasons, obviously. Whether this was a unique crew or whether it was a nation state is still up in the air. That being said, I think the functional reality of today's world is true ROI for cybersecurity consists of decreasing dwell time and having greater situational awareness as to once an adversary has gotten in. Most large enterprises will not be able to be 100% correct all of the time, but they have to react faster and be able to hunt the adversary within their infrastructure. So if they don't have the tools or telemetry to look behind them or to assess inside-out threats, they end up with a breach that lasts longer.
Speaking of response time, that's worth thinking about, that when we see different organizations suffer breaches, we see a great diversity in time to respond. Chili's was just breached, for example. We first heard rumors of that at the end of last week. They disclosed over the weekend. They disclosed relatively rapidly. Equifax did not. And one of the principal reputational hits that Equifax took was over the way it seemed to drag its heels over letting people know what had happened. So here's a question. Why is it that organizations take so long to disclose? Do any of you know of any occasion where closing your eyes and ignoring the problem actually lets the problem go away and it quietly tide it over? Do you know of any occasion where that's happened? Is this reluctance to disclose just an ordinary, irrational human bit of wishful thinking? What do you think? Shira, you want to take that?
Sure. I think, first the logical thing was let's assess how much is really breached. Maybe also trying to come up with the right response to the media and to whoever's been breached. I think it's also, trying to understand just the magnitude of it, but also holding back to see really how much they have to disclose to. And it depends on the organization as well. I think it's all organizational based. But, getting the messaging right, figuring out, with their lawyers, speaking to their lawyers and understanding what the ramifications of it, but really getting the keen understanding of the breach as a whole. And I think it's a real problem, the fact that the disclosure takes so long. Certainly with Equifax, we could talk about the Facebook breach and just all the breaches down the road. Holding on to that information yields all sorts of problems, not only with reputational based, talk about insider trading. There's just so many problems and factors around it. And there's no true good reason to tell a company that they should hold on to it besides their lawyers saying don't say anything yet till we're ready to assess everything and understand what we're facing here.
So it's not going to go away on its own?
No.
Bad news isn't going to improve with age.
It's going to surface one way or the other, and they want to make sure their messaging is right once it does.
Well, one of the things that was very problematic, and raised a lot of eyebrows in the case of Equifax, and this is not to prejudge anything or make any sort of invidious conclusion, but there were some senior people at Equifax who sold a lot of Equifax shares between the time the breach was discovered and the time it was publicly disclosed. So there's clearly some urgency in getting things like that out. Do you have any thoughts, either one of you, on speed of disclosure? Certainly GDPR in 10 days is going to require 3 days disclosure.
GDPR is going to be very interesting for U.S. corporations. 3 days to eliminate dwell time, 3 days to achieve telemetry, 3 days to involve law enforcement, legal counsel, and have your PR team lined up and ready to go. The European Commission and commissioners are chomping at the bit to penalize an American corporation who doesn't understand that privacy and cybersecurity are intertwined. It's going to be a tough road to hoe. I don't think most corporations in the U.S. are truly prepared besides having a policy. But when the rubber hits the road, we'll see. 10 days, right?
Yeah, the 25th of this month.
Yeah, I also think the time to disclose issue is muddied simply because some organizations may find materiality to be subjective. So if there is no materiality in the breach, if something was compromised that was not of consequence and doesn't have certain type of data or doesn't exist in a privileged segment of the network, then maybe they argue that they don't have to report that and they have internal counsel to guide them through that process and things like that. But I also think that as far as GDPR, what I think we start to see is GDPR fines as an attack vector. So we see denial of service as a way to bring down revenue numbers for a business because they can't transact or they can't sell anything on their website. But what happens if I can now find a database of a company that I know has European Union data and then publicly disclose that and hit them with 4% of their global revenue? That's much more effective than bringing down their website for 8 hours. So now the attackers may start to use this new regulation to their advantage as an attack vector, I think. I know that's a little off the disclosure discussion. But.
No, I mean, it's already begun. That there are phishing campaigns underway this week that are promising GDP hardening services for the people who are worried and are unwary enough to open that stuff. Well, I mean, there are questions of standards of care that you raised, I think, Sean. Is that right? What about the newest revision to the NIST framework and its emphasis on resilience? Is that going to effectively serve as a de facto kind of standard of care for the industry, or are we just going to do what we usually do and let the plaintiff's bar set?
I think that's actually huge. Dr. Ron Ross, who's been a champion of NIST standards for years, really took a giant leap forward with this guidance. resiliency for a long time was about business continuity and the capacity to withstand or maintain operations simplistically. But he's saying resilient to a manifestation of an adversary within your infrastructure in real time. Essentially, he's recommending that you have the capacity, you have to challenge yourself to suppress an adversary within your infrastructure, to inhibit the resiliency of the adversary in addition to maintaining your own resiliency. And I think it's brilliant, and it's a huge leap forward, and I commend Dr. Ron Ross for what he's done with that.
Yeah, and I think as far as the framework updates that recently took place, I think that we've all seen this in the industry. I mean, everybody's moving away from prevention to response and recovery, and really the key indicator becomes less about what was your percentage of successfully compromised systems or lack thereof for an organization, and more about what was your time to detection and how can you minimize that. There's organizations, there's an entire industry in deception. I mean, there's organizations that purposely put out vulnerable systems, as you know, honeypots, things like that, to try and understand more about what their vulnerabilities are and their attack patterns that they likely will be successfully compromised through. So I think that the response and recovery piece of the NIST framework is really leading the industry as far as what is selling and what exactly these companies are using to protect themselves.
Well, I think they pretty much covered it, but I will just add to it that I would look at the NIST framework almost like the stepping stone to what's going to come. It's not the full gamut of what needs to happen, but really the beginnings of it.
Well, to turn back to incident response, one of the executives who sold a bunch of Equifax stock was the chief financial officer. And Equifax has assured everybody that he didn't know. He didn't know about the breach at the time he sold it. And he said the same thing. So, there you have it. But what that suggests is that the CFO was not part of the incident response plan at Equifax. What kinds of things should you be thinking about when you're assembling an incident response team for an organization? Shira, you want to start?
Well, I think the messaging has to be clear. I think the same messaging across the organization as a whole. I think they have to understand who has access to what information and how it's going to be utilized, and to keep notes of it. I think backups need to happen off premises. A lot of companies talk about their information being stored, and they do backups, except they're storing it on the grounds itself. So when you're talking about ransomware and you're talking about these breaches, you lose access to the information that gets out there. If you do the backups off and it's encrypted and you do it properly, you're tightening up there. But in terms of, company knowing and who should know, if these are, the officers of the organization, they should be privy, they should be aware of the proper information, and it should be securely satiated in the company.
Is there anyone who you would want to keep off of an incident response team simply for their own protection, or the reasons that you might want someone not involved?
Well, I think it's on a company-to-company basis. You can't say specifically, I don't want Mr. X knowing because I don't trust him. I think you really have to understand.
Not that you don't trust that Mr.
No, I
X,
understand,
but is there
yes.
anyone whose role makes
Well,
it
I guess it's,
inappropriate?
again, company to company. When you look at all sectors of organizations, I don't think any company runs exactly the same, even sector to sector. Mm-hmm. I think it's based on the roles and the responsibilities of that individual within the company itself, and it has to be really dialed down to the right people itself.
And I also think it comes down to proactive testing, right? How are you going to know what these likely pitfalls are that you're going to hit in the heat of the moment, under a lot of pressure, with a lot of people demanding results? How can you make sure that you're not falling victim to those issues, in a controlled environment with enough resources that you can actually get something done? As far as backups, I 100% agree. That's one of the most common things we find is that, truly virtualized infrastructure, and they have their backups on-prem, that type of thing. But also, how often do you test those backups, right? If you have a ransomware outbreak and it's been going on for weeks and you didn't realize it, your backups may have been overwritten with trash data that's encrypted. So those type of things, regularly testing those processes, as well as testing the actual incident response plan through tabletop exercises and scenarios like that to understand what exactly the limitations are of not only your IT group, but also your communication channels, right? If your email server goes down, or you have a PBX environment, what have you, you can't communicate. What exactly do you do next? Who calls who, and how do you make sure you don't have this calling tree of noise going around the environment? So I think that's a great place to start for that incident response effort.
You know, one of the challenges of today's environment is if you're a major publicly traded corporation or if you do business with a major publicly traded corporation, you'll be targeted by an adversary that leverages counter incident response capabilities against you. There's some of you in the audience that I've seen that have probably dealt with this, and they respect the fact that the adversary is going to be using multiple command and controls, some on sleep cycles. They're going to be using dual-use tools or good tools against you, like WMI, PowerShell. And I'm going down the rabbit hole of naming these specific kind of protocols and programs because when you conduct incident response, you also need to stand up a hunt team to be trying to think like the adversary from inside out to assess where else they might have compromised, where else they may have compromised user credentials and escalated privileges to become super users. And to do that, you really need to have capacity to digest all unfiltered data from all the endpoints in your infrastructure because of mobility and cloud. And you have to be able to assess that data for anomalies, and you have to be able to assess for root cause analysis of events. And so before you are compromised by an adversary in today's world, and trust me, we will all eventually be compromised, you have to stand up a hunt team that's multidisciplinary, that consists of IR folk, pen testers, cyber threat intelligence folks, and someone who can write and translate to the board. And this team needs to be hunting your infrastructure and across your supply chain for an adversary's footprint. And trust me, if you feel like you're going to be targeted by a nation-state adversary, or if you feel like you're going to be targeted by elite Eastern European or South American hacker crews, you need to get on it now, and you need to believe in capabilities and tool sets like EDR, like adaptive authentication, and like deception technologies that you can lay out along attack paths that you cannot harden.
When you look at what happened to Equifax, they were actually hit through a known but unpatched vulnerability. Okay, it was a problem with Apache struts that was known, was publicly declared, it was patched. The patch was available, they hadn't applied the patch, and the attackers ran rampant through their system. So the first part of the question I'll pose to you is, why would you not patch in a case like this? And it's not just that Equifax wasn't doing it, that as recently as this past week, a very large number of very large corporations are still downloading and installing unpatched versions of Apache struts. So that's one question. The second question is related to that, and it's about supply chain issues. We tend to think of supply chain issues in terms of hardware, in terms of bad USB drives, things like that. But there's a software supply chain, and especially as we get farther into machine learning and AI solutions, there's also a data supply chain, because AI needs to be trained, and what it's trained on is data. How do you know the data you have are good? What can you do to address data supply chain and other supply chain issues? So I'll let Tom take this one first.
So the information supply chain consists of, obviously, the software vendors, but it also consists of the professional services vendors that you rely upon. Your outside general counsel, trust me, law firms have terrible cybersecurity. They got great physical security, and they know local law enforcement, but they have terrible cybersecurity. So could it be possible that I get compromised through a law firm of significance? Your outside marketing firms are creating great exposures to you, especially since 95% of the budgeted marketing is going towards digital marketing, and it's being outsourced to essentially folks to create the apps and the blogs and all of these things that create vulnerability for you. And to this point, and I really want to stress this, there has been a shift in the elite hacker crews of the world to actually create secondary infections and use your brand against your constituency. So after they steal what they want from you, they then island hop, which means move through your network to networks who trust you. And therein, then they leverage the websites of those networks into watering holes. It means a good websites become polluted, and to begin to attack people who visit those subpages. A famous group that does this is Stone Panda. Stone Panda is a Chinese organization that's been targeting the Fortune 100. Stone Panda has been leveraging island hopping through cloud-based attacks against major corporations, and then going after their major strategic partners and major customers through watering hole attacks against their constituency for the purposes of economic espionage. It's elegant. You think, why would they do that? Because the environment has shifted from burglary to home invasion, and we just have to respect that. And to the IR part, we have to be careful that if we react too loudly to the adversary in real time, they could choose to set our house on fire. And they're doing more and more of that. A study that's going to be coming out next week from my organization will speak to trends of counter-incident response and lateral movement in the financial sector, which you should check out.
So what about it, either supply chain or why aren't people patching?
So I think the patching issue is a given. I mean, yes, it's an easy patch to apply, but one, if they had compensating controls in place that they considered to be adequate, maybe they opted to not apply that patch because it was a legacy application, what have you, right? So there's many reasons why somebody may choose to not patch. What I had a problem with was there was a finger-pointing situation with Equifax where the executive team was pointing at the IT team saying, why didn't you patch this? What they're missing is a giant level of middle management that, for one reason or another, probably vetoed this effort, or it was left off the table because of time, resource, what have you. I think that the supply chain question is a little more interesting because what we do with organizations, typically as a consultant, is work with them to map out data as an initial step towards a framework resolution, whether that's an encryption strategy or what have you. Using data mapping efforts in addition to vendor management strategies to understand where that data lives through the life cycle of the transaction. And we were talking about this in the hallway, but this will be easier in the future as blockchain becomes more and more adoptable. But what we're seeing is that people are doing a good job of finding internal data, which historically has not been the case up until very recently. So unstructured data is becoming identified, being classified, and then protected with controls like encryption and things like that. But then once it gets to the vendor, that vendor management process is completely different. And I think that's where the gap is. And the industry can probably look to that integration of those two functions to close that.
I'll just add one little piece in terms of the patching, that if somebody's running version 2.2 and there's specific patching for that, even though it's not as secure, to make them go to version 3 is not as easy as it seems for such a large organization. So to tell them to patch it is not a simple tool. So if there's other things that are, let's call it on fire, that they have to deal with, let's patch it and move on. So those things aren't taken as seriously as they should.
And I suppose it's not trivial to patch any IT system.
No.
It's probably worth mentioning that when you talk about the industrial IoT, patching becomes far more complex than
Correct.
that. That you may have a system based on Windows XP still,
Right.
but it's not as easy as just applying an XP fix. It's XP as implemented by Honeywell or Siemens or some company like that. I'll offer one final question, move a little bit afield to talk about a culture of security, and then we'll take questions from the audience. We've been hearing about power grid threats and threats to the power grid. And again, this past week, we've heard from a variety of sources that there is a continued interest on the part of a threat actor. Dragos is calling them Alanite. They don't say this, but it's probably Russia's GRU, Russian military intelligence, that's engaging in reconnaissance and battle space preparation of the US and UK power grids. And they've been doing this in an interesting way. They have been doing it through phishing, through social engineering. So what kinds of suggestions would you have for an organization that wanted to create the kind of culture of security that's resistant to that sort of social engineering? Shira, do you want to start with?
Sure. When you're talking about phishing, you're talking about exploiting the human weakness, which again, the weakest chain in the link. So a lot of companies today, what they'll do is they'll do some sort of yearly protocol for their company to learn about don't fall prey to phishing, maybe some phishing training a little bit once or twice a year. At the end of the day, people are moving very quickly in the organization in general, getting their work done, getting things done, and people aren't stopping and pausing before action. So when it comes to phishing, when you need to educate the user, it needs to be on an ongoing basis. And you have to look at every single person in the organization as a weakest link in the chain, not just upper management. Because you can penetrate an organization from anyone within the organization. And if they're not given the proper training and protocol and tools and security around it, then you're just opening the door for phishing attempts and entree into the organization, which could yield in any one of these attacks.
Yeah, so social engineering, 100%. It's always going to happen, right? Until we remove the human from the computing interface or the interaction with the computer, it's always going to happen. I think that seeing that these major situations these breaches start with some sort of social engineering should be an indicator to develop a robust internal plan, which what you articulated. And I think that capitalizing on that and saying, okay, from a critical infrastructure standpoint, you have to look at your users slightly differently. In my opinion, sitting on the, listening to that last panel where they were talking about where they would spend money, to your point, EDR is paramount in a situation where you're going to have one user that may need to have administrative access to a turbine in the middle of a field in Montana, but he needs that access. How can you make sure that that's somebody that is very sophisticated as far as his understanding of that machinery also knows not to click a link in an email? I mean, it's relatively ridiculous. So understanding to minimize the attacker's movement is the primary goal. It's not to stop them from getting in, although that is our goal, right? Let's just assume that's going to happen. Let's minimize their movement, restrict them to one workspace, and hopefully that's a VDI environment or something that can be terminated or rebuilt very easily.
And I'll interrupt briefly before I give Tom the last word in response to this question. I should have explained, I think everybody in this room is familiar with what social engineering is. In case somebody is not, social engineering is fundamentally just a con job. It's a way of talking about a con job. Everyone in this room has received the phone call saying, this is the Microsoft help desk. We have detected a problem with your machine. Please give us your password and we'll fix it. That's social engineering. Okay, go ahead, please.
So you can hack someone through spear phishing without them actually clicking the link or downloading the attachment based on a lot of different things. Let's start there. The Russians have been very actively targeting critical infrastructure since 2012. The geopolitical tension that has been enhanced since then has correspondingly created a cyber manifestation that aligned with the Gerasimov doctrine, who was a famous general in Russia. That being said, they have colonized wide swaths of critical infrastructures in the US. They're already inside of these systems now. So yes, we can talk about the prevention side of things, the fact that they're using fileless malware to target endpoints that needs to be disrupted. So 90% of the traditional AV vendors don't solve that problem. Or you can talk about how do you get them out, because they're already in, right? So you need to stand up that hunt team. You need to use things like deception technology on attack paths that you cannot harden. A lot of these systems have to stay up. They can't employ that patch. They have to maintain resiliency because it's the energy grid, or it's other things that maintain water or aviation, et cetera. That's where deception comes in as a very useful capability. But also we need to get back to understand that whitelisting, now known as ironboxing, it has modernized, it has been enhanced, and it has great utility within these utilities, ironically, because it allows you to create a safe state where anomalies will be effectively alerted to your hunt team to pursue said hunt. But yeah, no, this is very troubling times. 22 years in cyber, I'm concerned.
Well, good. We've gone through the questions we had planned. What I'd like to do now with the remaining amount of time we have left is throw it open to the audience. Do you have any questions for our panel? I have one up there, please.
Yeah, one thing that I haven't heard a lot of discussion about today that I'm sort of surprised about is the impact that quantum computing is going to have on us. And with governments doing mass amounts of data warehousing of pretty much everything that's going over the internet, what is your approach to future-proof your data and secure that? Because most modern encryption is going to be essentially worthless. So, what are your thoughts around that?
So the question, if anybody didn't hear, is about the implications of quantum computing, which would effectively render current modes of encryption useless. Would open up your data to being broken.
So real quick on encryption. Somewhere in your infrastructure, even if you've got the best encryption in the world and you do the greatest things, there is a key that unlocks it. And usually it sits on an endpoint, or usually it's associated with an authentication mechanism from a user that consists of a biometric coupled with something else. And that's why if we don't improve endpoint security, they will always be able to get into the encryption, which they do now today, because they compromise the endpoints that house the key to unlock the great crypto. You don't necessarily have to just blast it with quant. One of the difficulties, though, is that people in our incident response over the years, we've made a fundamental mistake. If you look at how people conduct incident response and how the best firms out there are doing it, they're forgetting one thing. So after they conduct the forensics, they employ patches and kill the malware, and after they write the after action report, and even if they have to re-image the machine entirely because of how deep the adversary got in, They then, if they have a large infrastructure, are just going to reissue new keys to everyone without dynamically verifying that Myrna is Myrna. And I'm sure that's Myrna. And right now, Myrna should get the new key that we're distributing because we've just cleaned up the mess. This is a huge gaping hole, which is why at RSA this year, the big security conference in San Fran, they said that identity had become the new perimeter in cybersecurity. It has. It has, because you need to dynamically verify or know your customer all over again, whether it's an employee or a customer. And it's a gaping hole. And I think we have to solve that problem first before we even tackle the weaknesses of crypto and the construct of that. So sorry to not answer your question, but to provide that answer.
Would you like to? Anyone else care to take a shot?
Yeah, so I think that the real impact is going to be in the e-commerce world, right? And SSL being obsolete and being replaced by something else. I think I'm confident. We're obviously we're not certain because nobody knows what the future holds. But I think it'll be very similar to what we're going to see in the next couple months with GDPR. Nobody really knows the ramifications of that until we see a victim and a precedent set, and then people can take what would be considered reasonable controls as the legislation is written. So right now it's somewhat subjective, and I feel like quantum computing will solve its own problem by creating some sort of encryption mechanism or some sort of obfuscation that will then defeat its own weakness, right? Or that it's created.
Please.
So, at high level, what percentage of this big cybersecurity problem that we've been talking about all day, in your opinion, is technology-based versus non-technology-based? The reason I'm asking is we're investing a lot, there's a lot of funding, there are a lot of industries, we've got about billion-dollar exits. On the news, it's nation states, we can't figure out the Russians, APTs and all that. And on the other hand, when we have actual breaches like Anthem, Yahoo, Home Depot, JCPenney, you look at root causes, either it's patching, people clicking on emails, password sharing, passwords, it's the basic stuff. And I understand it's not easy to patch, but the technology is there. So are we over-inventing, or do you think there is room for better technology that can fix this patching problem, which is otherwise a legacy thing altogether?
Well,
Did everyone hear that?
Yeah.
To summarize briefly, the question is, what percentage of the problems we've been talking about today are technical problems, which are non-technical problems, and what can we do about basic cyber hygiene, which seems to be at the root of many of them? Go ahead.
Well, I think it goes hand in hand. Technology, security, whether it be the human problem or the technology problem, I think you have to cover all of it. I think sometimes organizations focus heavily on the security piece and let's just build layer upon layer upon layer upon technology, and they forget there's a human sitting behind all this technology. If you put too many layers and too many steps, they'll circumvent it, go around it, or just move too quickly and just bypass it. I think that you have to look at each of them as an important part that goes together completely. You got to work on your human factors. You got to deal with all these, the insider threat behavior analytics, keeping your, let's call it patches up to date, your security up to date, your backups up to date. All of it has to happen simultaneously to have a very tight organization. You can't have one without the other, because then you'll have a weak link and it'll come right in. You don't have the right technology, it's not going to happen either. They're all important. They all have to happen together.
So I echo that, and I think putting everything in a framework, taking these tactical objectives that we're talking about and making a strategic plan, whether that's several months or several years for an organization, is huge. But to answer your question, or to summarize it into what I would consider to be a simpler question to give you the same answer, if I were to pick one thing that I could change in the industry that would help generally improve security all across the board, it would be education of the C-suite to give governance to the people that are actually implementing these potential controls. These deficiencies are not necessarily something they didn't have in place. They didn't not have a patch management system. They didn't implement it for some reason or another. Was it a management decision? Was it an oversight? Do they need more people? That dedication of the C-level and the governance required to implement these controls properly is really the gap.
so yes, CISOs shouldn't be reporting to CIOs anymore, period. Your defensive coordinator reporting to your offensive coordinator is ridiculous, especially when there is an arms race in cyberspace, especially when there are nation states targeting private corporations, et cetera. And that being said, the architecture itself, the cybersecurity architecture that we've been mimicking or building for years, is based on really a castle-like defense in depth model, which has failed. because of mobility and because of cloud, because of application attacks, because of fileless malware, because of the fact that these folks are using lateral movement techniques to obfuscate their behavior and they're riding within your crypto, it's failed. And an over-reliance on crypto, for that matter, has failed us. So I suggest that a new architectural paradigm must be established, and that is one called intrusion suppression. So instead of visualizing a castle, visualize a supermax prison. Force the adversary to become situationally unaware in your environment. Allow yourself the capacity to detect in real time, divert, deceive, contain, and hunt an adversary, unbeknownst to an adversary in real time. If you can achieve that and create a prioritization of expenditures accordingly, I think you can be quasi-successful.
Other questions? Go ahead, please.
So I see a lot of efforts being put into preventing hacking, preventing access to the data. We all know that hacking will occur eventually, the data will get out there. So with the current methodologies of approving loans, approving different things, still using social security numbers, which creates value for this data that they're accessing. Why are we not focusing on taking some of that effort, focusing on changing the methodologies of what the data provides and controlling the value of the data, so we eliminating that value, therefore it has no profitability for the people who are getting access to it.
So the question is, are there ways that the panel might recommend of limiting the value of the data to an attacker? Is that a fair gloss? Sean, you're in the middle. You want to take that one?
So, yeah, so I think the question that you have is also a bigger issue, right? Why are we using numbers to identify individuals anymore? Social security numbers, credit card numbers, why? That's the type of thing that it's going to take monumental effort to change that. But that is a fundamental weakness, and it's going to eventually catch up, right? So we're putting Band-Aids on it, chip and pin for credit cards, what have you, but there is no current resolution to replacing all of that. So I think, to limit the attacker's success, to exemplify your point, there was a realtor that the story goes, basically somebody had just sold their house. They sent a $400,000 payment to an attacker because the attacker had compromised the realtor's inbox. The realtor said, send the payment to this account number. They immediately sent another email saying, oh wait, that was the wrong account number, here's the second. Why are we sending account numbers over email, right? And PGP just got destroyed, right? So now maybe that is, some of these little things start to change the industry, and maybe the real estate industry doesn't use email to send account numbers anymore.
I'll also add, I think it also boils down to a little bit before that question, identity. What do we really qualify as identity? Identifying somebody for real. We talk about social security numbers. I was in grad school. That was our identity. It's out there. Your mother's maiden name, that's out there. You could talk about thumbprints. They can be lifted. You talk about even voice privacy. How many people here have Alexa in their house? How many people keep on Alexa all the time in their house? Exactly. So, when they talk about gathering data, they could say, well, it's being gathered for advertisements, or it's being gathered just for data so they can sell better. But it's also grabbing your voice. There's just so much around that. I'm involved in a little bit of voice stuff, which is quite interesting. They talk about all sorts of identifying factors, and I think that we have to come to a better way of authenticating individuals that you can almost bypass some of these big problems.
I agree.
I think we've got time for one more quick question. One more, go ahead.
What's the most overhyped thing you hear that irritates you?
What?
Press and Facebook, whatever, your aunt, your grandmother, what is the most irritating thing?
For me personally, it's the movie hacking type of thing, where the CSI Miami, whatever, they type a couple keys and they've done a forensic analysis of 20 terabytes. Like, that's the type of stuff I can't stand.
I'm not going to answer that one.
It's when they finish typing, they always say, I'm in.
Right.
Right, that's it.
Yeah. Give it a flu shot.
Anything overhyped, Shira, that you can think of?
There are a lot of overhyped things. I think kind of segue a little bit away from your question, if that's okay. I think oversharing is a massive problem. I think people are saying in the organizations, well, we tightened up everywhere, but they forget everybody has social media. And when you deal with social media, even people's personal accounts, people are oversharing all over the place, and they don't understand how they got breached or how they got hacked. And they look back, and you can do an analysis of it, and you see all the information leading up to a trusted actor. And then, get into the organization. So I don't understand why this happened to me. It's kind of frustrating because it's very clear.
And to just piggyback on her answer, the oversharing, right?
Yeah.
So people are up in arms about the Facebook issue with Cambridge Analytica, but then when they opt to give all this data to Facebook, you can't necessarily be mad with what they do with it. I mean, if it's in their terms of service that they're going to use it in any way they want, and they're using the honor system to verify their vendors, I mean, it's the end user that's the problem, right?
So your view is that we are all basically like guests on the old Jerry Springer show, where someone would confess to something shameful in front of millions of television viewers and then say, if people knew about this, I don't know how I'd go on living.
Right.
It's like that. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank the panel. Again, I'm John Petrik. I'm the editor of the CyberWire. Thanks very much. And I'd like to remind you all, if you're interested in specific solutions, we've deliberately not talked about products or solutions, but there are a number of companies out there that are all worth talking to. So by all means, stop and see them. Thank you very much.